The Soviet Union was formed in 1922 and collapsed in 1991. The Soviet Union, also known as the USSR, was a communist country, and many countries did not believe in this type of government. The other countries did not believe in this type of government because the Soviet Union was controlling the people's lives, and it wasn't fair for them. The Soviet Union wanted to take control of all of Europe and all of Asia, and this is how the Cold War started. The Cold War started in 1945 and was fought between the Soviet Union and the United States. The war started right after World War II. World War II was still going on because the Americans and the Japanese were still major enemies. The Americans won the war by this new weapon that they created called the atomic bomb. This was the most powerful weapon yet. Many countries wanted this weapon, including the Soviet Union. These countries wanted this weapon because they wanted to be the most powerful country with the most powerful weapon. Many scientists tried to create this new weapon just like the Americans, but many have failed. As scientists tried to create this new weapon, there came along new technology that allowed them to create new weapons. One of these weapons was called the Nike missile. The Nike missile allowed the missile to lock on the targets and let the missile follow them. This time period was mostly about improving weapons for their army. After World War II and after the death of Hitler, Germany's government fell apart. The country was divided into 4 different zones. In 1946, the Soviet Union took control of the eastern part of Germany. Once the Soviet Union took control of the eastern part of Germany, the western part of Germany was getting nervous. Therefore, the Berlin blockade happened in 1948. The Soviet Union had control of eastern Berlin and wanted to control eastern and western Berlin. The Soviet Union blockaded the western parts railroads and roadways. Therefore, the Western Allies formed the Berlin Airlift. The Berlin Airlift gave food and supplies to all the western parts of Berlin for almost a year. After World War II, Europe's structure and economy was destroyed. The United States wanted to help rebuild Europe's economy. In 1948, the Economic Cooperation Act was in place to help rebuild Europe's economy. In 1949, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization was formed to protect countries from the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union army was increasing and was taking control of other countries. That is why the NATO was formed to protect one another. These countries are a part of the NATO: Belgium, Great Britain, Italy, Iceland, Luxembourg, United States, Canada, Netherlands, Denmark, Norway, and Portugal. In 1955, West Germany, Turkey, and Greece joined. All these countries joined together to make government decisions and military decisions. Even today, the NATO is still formed together and is still helping one another. The NATO affects countries in many different ways. The Cold War had a lot of things happening during the 1940s. Many countries' government, economy, and structures were affected because of the Cold War and the Soviet Union. Many things changed in the 1950s and the 1960s.
The late 1950s was a crucial time in America. In 1955, the Warsaw Pact was formed. It was subscribed by 8 communist states in Eastern Europe and was established at the USSR Initiative and realized on May 14, 1955 in Warsaw, Poland. In 1956, the rebellion was put down in communist Hungary. Egypt took control of the Suez Canal and the US refused to help take it back. On October 4, 1957, Sputnik was launched into orbit. In November of 1958, Khrushchev demands withdrawal of troops from Berlin. In January of 1959, Fidel Castro and Khrushchev visited America, but they were denied access to Disneyland. A new crisis was soon to occur. President Eisenhower announces a plan for the U.S. to launch a 3.6-pound satellite. This instigated the space race. A Soviet ballistic missile launched the world's first artificial satellite, the 183-pound Sputnik 1. In response to Sputnik, Eisenhower established the Advanced Research Projects Agency, reporting directly to the Secretary of Defense. This era of the war was a huge impact on how the war's favor went to the U.S.
June 25, 1950. North Korean troops crossed the 38th parallel in force. Within hours, they the attack, the United States responded. It pushed a resolution through the UN Security Council that gave the UN's approval and support for military action against North Korea. The U.S. began to support South Korea, but North Korea kept pushing the South down Venezuela, American bombing missions having no effect. In response, Americans called in troops stationed in Japan to help the South in holding the Pusan bridgehead through June and July. Finally, after 3 years, the war ended July 1953. Then, 6 years later, comes the Vietnam War. Communists ruled North Vietnam and non-communist South Vietnam. The North Vietnamese and some of their South Vietnamese supporters fought to take over the South. It was a long, sad-filled war that finally ended April 30th, 1975.
The 1960s was an important time period between the United States and the Soviet Union. Most historians say it is the closest we have been to nuclear war. In May 1960, a U.S. U-2 spy plane was shot down by the Soviet Union. The pilot safely ejected but was captured by the Soviets. 1 year later, he was released to the U.S. Later that year, December 19th, Cuba openly aligns itself with the Soviet Union. This presents a real threat to the U.S. because Cuba is only 90 miles from Florida. In 1961, the Bay of Pigs invasion was an unsuccessful attempt by United States-backed Cuban exiles to overthrow the government of the Cuban dictator Fidel Castro, increasing friction between the United States and Cuba. August 13, 1961, the Berlin border closing. August 17, 1961, the construction of the Berlin Wall begins. 1962, the U.S. suspects that there is a Soviet missile in Cuba. 1962, the Soviet Union foreign minister warns that American attack on Cuba would mean war with the Soviet Union. On October 14th, a spy plane confirms the U.S.'s worst nightmare, that there is a Soviet site in Cuba. The Joint Chiefs of Staff strongly advised Kennedy to make an airstrike on the Soviet missile site in Cuba. On October 28th, the Soviet leader announces the removal of the Soviet missiles from Cuban territory. November 1963, John F. Kennedy is assassinated in Dallas, Texas. Many believe the Soviet Union is involved. In October of 1964, Communist China created a nuclear bomb. This poses another threat to the U.S. The space race. The space race was between the United States and the Soviet Union. Both countries were trying to create technology to get humans into space. On July 16, 1969, the U.S. launched Apollo 11 mission. On July 20, 1969, Neil Armstrong became the first man to walk on the moon.
The Soviet Union made a big pack on the Eastern Hemisphere. The Soviet Union changed during this period of time. The government had changed and the economy had changed. The government changed to be a communist country. The communist government caused the economy to change since the government controlled mostly everything. The economy decreased and forced the culture to change. Over time, the economy fell, and that led to the fall of the Soviet Union.